apply and everything, feel free to write me at president@gtabrews.ca or post on our social media. We'll definitely get back to you.
And there you go, Devin. You should be good to go.
You can hear me all right?
Don't forget to record, David.
Yep.
Already on, Eric. Already got it.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's nice for the opportunity to shop. Give you guys a little bit of an update on what we're up to. So I've got a couple of things, sort of focuses that I wanted to talk about tonight. One of those being sort of Barley Varieties. We're just wrapping up a sort of a 4-year project of exploring new barley varieties that we can use in Ontario for a couple of different reasons. Like first of all, for agronomics and sort of quality success, and then secondly, sort of to address the shifting trends, the craft brewing industry in particular, like sort of the demand from the commercial breweries is sort of evolving, and in terms of what they are looking for in chemistry. So we've been working to address that. So before I dive into it, I've got a few slides, mostly just some data tables. So I'm going to use malt analysis, certificate of analysis spreadsheets to sort of highlight how these varieties are differentiated. It's really the most sort of tangible way to differentiate barley varieties. I mean, they're not sort of classified by sort of flavors and aromas in the way that hop varieties would be, for example. So we really use malt chemistry as our sort of baseline for identifying, evaluating, and differentiating barley varieties. So, so I've got some tables just looking at some of these varieties we've been exploring, be looking at sort of historical sort of profiles for North American versus European varieties. And then I've got some tables with data from our own malt analysis, just so I can sort of really show how variety selection has affected the final product in terms of the malt chemistry for what we're putting out. I guess I'd introduce our business quickly before I dive right into it. So I'm maltster, founder, everything else at Barn Owl Malt. We're a pretty small operation. My wife Leslie and I own and operate, and then we have a full-time employee helping us out these days, which has been a big help. We're working on our 5th year now of production, so I guess the project's running about 7 years from inception, but we've been producing and selling now for 5 years. For malting, if you're not already familiar with our product, at least in sort of name, but we built a floor malt facility originally for sort of barrier of entry reasons, but we've sort of evolved that into a niche product, and it's got some advantages for us that that have paid off really well. And then we're producing sort of a little over 200 tons a year right now. That's our sort of current production capacity. So we launched 5 years ago running sort of 50 to 60 tons, and over those 5 years we've been able to sort of increase that to about 200. And then we're in the process now, like we're just, now that the spring weather is sort of the winter's broken, we're installing an expansion project. So we're shooting for sort of a purchase contract for this crop year of about 450 tons to feed the new system, the new expansion. So we're pretty excited about that, but it's going to be a busy summer to try to get that up and running and before the frost again. So the expansion project, we originally were going to expand directly with floor space, like expand and double our capacity with floor capacity. But we had an opportunity last year. Like there's been some real shifts in the industry throughout North America. We've been fortunate in terms of demand and continued demand throughout, the ups and downs, but it hasn't been the same throughout North America. And we got an opportunity to pick up some equipment, germination vessels, some mechanical automated systems. So we're gonna double our capacity through the installation of a pneumatic malting system. So we'll be running a couple of different product lines based on that, and then hopefully that will ultimately pay for a second floor, because we'd like to continue growing the floor malt line as sort of more of a focus than sort of a pneumatic malting approach. But it will be a bit of a different product, so we'll have to market it differently. We wanted to be sort of transparent in sort of expansion plans, just since we've built a brand around floor malting. But I think it's going to fit well with sort of some of the contract demand that we have, and just they're serving customers that are very specifically sort of interested in floor malt versus customers that are more specifically interested in grain origin, for example. So that's the Barn Owl Malt update. And so starting to move into the discussion of barley varieties and malt chemistry. Let me see, I'll share the screen on this. I can still see myself. Yeah.
There you go. Yep.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay, so this is as I was sort of mentioned, introducing it. This is part of there are two main reasons for why we've been exploring new varieties. So right now, we're actually working with we're working with both of the new varieties that we've selected. We didn't really anticipate having those varieties into the malt house before the 2021 harvest, but we got fortunate with some of the breeding programs and the foundation seed sort of multiplier farms that we were able to pull some volume out of those breed up programs and start malting with it this winter. So we're currently working with these two new varieties. And these varieties are based out of Germany. Both of these varieties are originally bred and developed in Germany. We've moved away from North American genetics with respect to the malting barleys. And big reasons for that. One, which is in respect to this slide. If you've started reading it already, that's good, because I didn't want to just read it start to finish. But ultimately, we're seeing a shift in the demand for malt chemistry. And really what's driving that in North America in particular is that the barley varieties that are most common and commercially sort of contracted and purchased in North America were bred and developed with adjunct brewing in mind. So they've been bred for low flavor, sort of opposition to point one. They've been bred for really high FAN, free amino nitrogen, because when you're using a lot of adjuncts, you need to add, additional nutrition to help with the fermentation. Lower total protein is being sort of looked at more sort of favorably. Again, North American varieties tend to have higher protein levels, and those protein levels are tied both to FAN and diastatic power. The higher protein barley is a correlation where nets higher FAN and higher DP in the malt. So North American barleys have been bred for higher protein to drive up the FAN and the DP essentially. And then the lower Kolbach index, so S&T ratio, and that's sort of a measure of, soluble and total protein, but we use that to really identify sort of the complete, how well modified, how fully modified the barley is as malt. So that we'll get into that a little bit more when we look at the malt analysis spec sheet, but the S&T ratio has a number of effects in terms of efficiency, home stability, flavor and shelf stability, pill haze, a number of issues that have really been developed and sort of optimized in the malting industry with adjunct brewing, like macro scale brewing in mind. So with the growth of the craft brewing industry throughout North America, we're seeing shifts in the demands for the brewing chemistry or for the malt chemistry to match all grain brewing, where you don't necessarily need such high diastatic power. You don't need such huge amounts of fan. You can be a little bit more flexible with your S&T ratios and distinctive flavors and aromas being main driver. And as I said earlier, the North American varieties were sort of bred to be flavor neutral. So we're looking for different varieties that we can sort of develop more pronounced, more aromatic malts. So taking all that into consideration, really the reason why we ended up looking at European varieties is because the European brewing industry has typically been more driven by all grain brewing compared to North America. So it's, the malts have evolved in Europe a little bit more towards adjunct brewing. I think it's becoming a little bit more common. And the malt brewing programs have sort of adapted to meet those needs. But in general, there are more balanced malt chemistry with respect to all grain brewing, because it's, at larger scales is more common in Europe to be using all malt as opposed to high adjunct brewing. So we were looking at those European varieties to try to meet these sort of key points that were identified for the North American craft industry. This was, these blurbs and slides from the American Brewing Association. They did a bunch of surveys with the craft brewers in terms of what they're looking for moving forward with the malt supply chain. So this is a bit of a breakdown of the consensus target, I should. So looking at those main points that I sort of introduced, they're just some numerical values that sort of indicate where they would like to be with malt chemistry. I can come back to that because we kind of need to look at this next slide, give a bit of an idea of where we're sort of coming from with North American barley varieties. So this table gives us a breakdown of 6-row, adjunct 2-row, and all malt 2-row. So those would be, this is giving a breakdown of what would be ideal malt chemistries for those types of brewing. The 6-row values might be the sort of numbers that a distillery would be looking for in terms of diastatic power and higher protein acceptability and stuff like that. But if you're so we'd be mostly just focused on the adjunct 2-row versus the all malt 2-row. And the current trends in sort of the North American varieties of barley, New Deal and Metcalf being the two varieties we've been working with up till now, they really match more closely the adjunct 2-row specifications. So we're looking at total protein at 12.8 at the top end, pushing 13%, whereas the projected consensus target, we're looking at 10.5 as a maximum. So that's a big difference. I mean, it seems like a small percentage, but in terms of agronomics and yielding barley, 2 or 3% protein difference is tremendous. And then we're looking at some of the key factors here. Would be diastatic power, looking for greater than 120 degrees, alpha amylase higher than 50 units. Compared to, you can look at the all malt, 110, the low end being acceptable, and 40 to 70. So comparing that to, well, they don't have alpha, diastatic power less than 150. So still looking for relatively high diastatic power, just primarily just because, although they're not adjunct brewing, there are a lot of raw grains being used, for example, or flake oats and other additions that stress the diastatic power. And then the fan being sub 150. So that's a really critical point with the fan in sub 150, because you'll see a lot of these North American varieties, adjunct rows are sort of up over 200. There's a big difference there. So it's just a bit of an overview. It's, some of these differences look pretty insignificant, but in the brew house they can be pretty important. Like total soluble protein acceptable up to 47%, and the low end for all malt acceptability being 38. Like, those are dramatically different malts. And a lot of those numbers, like in the malt house, there's a certain amount of control we have over sort of this S&T ratio versus diastatic power, alpha amylase levels. A lot of the processes that affect those values are coupled. So we can't, for example, drop the S&T ratio down to 38% and then also expect to have, a diastatic power up in the 150 or alpha amylase in the 70. There's sort of a give and take throughout the whole process. So we're really sort of controlled, or sort of those final numbers are really driven by genetics of the barley and what potentials are in the barley. I mean, you still need to malt it well and effectively at those optimum numbers, but in terms of the relationships between, the sort of hitting those targets where you're getting modified, well maintaining, diastatic power in the appropriate spot. It is really driven by barley genetics in terms of us trying to target any one sort of element in the malt analysis specifically. So color, another one, for example, the color of the malt. So if we take a very low protein malt, for example, lower protein tends to have lower enzyme, lower diastatic power. And then as you add color to a malt through kilning, you're degrading enzyme in that process, and there's a trade-off. So for example, in the scenario where you're working with a 10% barley, you're not necessarily going to be able to achieve both a Vienna malt at 5 or 6 SRM and maintain a diastatic power at 130 or 140. You're going to have to sacrifice some of the diastatic power in place of color. So there are sort of pros and cons to moving into sort of going too far into low fan, low protein, just in terms of being able to manage a range of products without having a separate barley variety for each style of malt. For example, like where you could use, in a scenario where we might use a North American variety for making Munich style and Vienna style malts because they can tolerate higher temperatures and still have the capacity for full self-conversion, whereas low protein European barley, we might not be able to maintain a high enough diastatic power. We're looking for colors, you know, at 5, 6, or 7 SRM. So next real sort of major driver for us for exploring the European varieties is agronomics. And so the barleys that we've been working with, Metcalfe and Newdale, are both bred and sort of optimized for prairie growing conditions, Western growing conditions. In the East, it's a pretty stressful growing environment for them, primarily with the high temperature, high humidity summer months, and then much higher risk of having rainfall on the barley near harvest. Harvest sprouting I've highlighted here, and that's been our sort of number one cause of barley failing quality in the last 5 years. Like when you average it out, we're probably rejecting 40% of the contracted acres on account of pre-harvest sprouting. And the European barleys, because the growing conditions in Europe are sort of, I guess, more similar to Eastern North America than they would be like, arid prairie growing conditions. They have what's called dormancy. The Western barley varieties have had dormancy bred out of them. So if they get wet once they're mature, like often when we're drying down barley in the field pre-harvest, it's fully mature and it's viable and it will germinate, but the moisture level might not be low enough yet for us to harvest it and store it. May not be storage stable yet. If it's at 17, 18% moisture, we've got to leave it in the field until it comes down to about 14 or 13. And in that window, if it gets rained on, it'll start to germinate in the field. It'll basically start malting. It's called Providence malt. It'll just start germinating in the field, and then it really reduces, depending on how severe the damage is. It can either just completely ruin the germination and the seed's no longer viable, or it can reduce the storage stability, so we have to use it sooner than later. So these pre-harvest sprouting values give us a really good indication that these European trial varieties, are resistant to pre-harvest sprouts. So the lower the number, the RVA number, the more severely damaged the barley is. So all these trials, this is Newdale, Metcalfe, and Synergy, another Western variety. These have been our two sort of flagship varieties for the last 5 years. All these barleys listed were grown in the same field. This was a field trial, so same conditions all around, side by side. And so they were all subject to a rain event just before harvest. All the Western varieties had RVAs under 30, and all the European varieties maintained up over 100, and in most cases over 130. 135 is sort of our threshold for being storage stable indefinitely. Anything below that, and it's got a shelf life. When it's down below 50, it might only last in storage for a couple of months before it dies. So it's really, really high risk, which is why it's been our major sort of cause for failing and not accepting the barley. So then protein, again, addressing the sort of demand for lower protein. Same idea here. The barleys were all grown in the same conditions, same soils, same fertilizer programs, and we're just showing consistently lower proteins by a couple percent. So 10.5 is probably a sweet spot for us in terms of being able to maintain color development potential with diastatic power, conversion potential, etc. And so all of those barleys, all those European varieties are sort of performing in that sweet spot. And then plumpness, we use that as sort of as a way to measure. I mean, ultimately for us, it's yield. The farmers are more looking at test weight, but for us, that'll affect efficiency of milling for the brew house. Malting losses, the higher the plumpness, the fewer malting loss we have, because we're cleaning out and sizing the grain through packaging, and so anything below 5/64 gets thrown away. So the higher the number, the better performance, the better process efficiency we get. All those European varieties are out competing. AC Synergy has a really good reputation for high yielding, but it's also highly susceptible to pre-harvest sprouts. So we've never really pursued that. And then fan levels. This table is not a great demonstration of the difference in fan levels and diastatic power alpha amylase, just because I don't feel that these malting trials were sort of optimized. Like these malting trials, when they're doing the lab malting conditions, they're using a single process for all the barley so that you have a comparative result for a set condition. Whereas when we're malting commercially, we're adjusting our process to match the barley. So a lot of these malts are over modified based on that Colbeck index. So 50%, 49%, 52%, like those are all over modified malts. And so that's going to sort of artificially drive up the fan and the alpha amylase and the what we would be in the malt house. Static are though under 100 on all of those European varieties. So that's it's a little bit low. I think we're sort of looking for over 100, 120 is probably a good spot for what the brewers are sort of starting to look for. But this may have to do with the kilning conditions. I think a little bit high temperature probably for those barleys specifically. So again, it's something that we could manage in the malt house, but it does give you a bit of an idea of how they're differentiating the European genetics from the North American genetics. Like us, under the same conditions, the diastatic power on the North American varieties was significantly higher. So finding like our own numbers in our own data, these barleys, I think we're getting a better idea of how we're differentiating the malt chemistry with the European varieties. So I've listed here, like this is all malt row, just a standard North American sort of ideal malt chemistry, I guess, for a base malt. A row base would be in this range. It's a bit of a wide range there listed on this chart, but it gives you an idea of where the North American standards are at. And then this is our Newdale typical. So this is based on 2019 Newdale barley that we were working with, and Metcalf typical again. So 2019 Metcalf crop. And then we've got Esma, which is one of the two varieties, and Kelly. So these are the two new European barley varieties that we're working with at Germany. And so, I mean, if you just run down the list and compare it to the all malt two row, you'll see clearly sort of how they're differentiating. Targeting extract potential. The Kelly, for example, 83.5, so that's well above. We're usually topping out at 80.1. The Newdale barley is basically max. 83.5, like that's a difference that's going to show up in a brew house, despite sort of specific efficiencies of the brewing process. Is enough of a difference. that's tied to protein. So we've got really low protein, sub 10 protein in the Kelly, and then so you're trading protein for carbohydrate, and for your extract levels high. So here we've got, if you look at the Metcalf, owned to very high protein, it's got 13.2, and the extract potential is sub 80. So the higher the protein, the lower the extract. Soluble proteins mostly in the similar range, with the exception of the Kelly's a bit lower. And that's true with the low protein, starting with it. Like, lower the protein in the barley, lower the enzyme activity during malting and in the finished malt. So protein breakdown during malting tends to be a little bit less aggressive with a low protein barley, but we're still getting S&T ratios into that 40 43% range. Static or fan quite a bit lower in the Kelly, in the European, both the European varieties. Still sort of very close to the New Dale, but that's a consequence of the high protein. So we would probably see a more similar profile to Kelly in a growing year, where the protein levels are a little bit lower, more moderate. And then diastatic power, another big difference here. Metcalf, for example, is always really, really hot. High fan, 220, 137 on the, compared to sub 200 and near the 100 mark for the diastatic power in the European varieties. So really, we're finding that these European varieties, it's a flyer. We've been watching these go through the trials for the last 4 or 5 years, and we got the opportunity to start malting with them earlier this winter, and it sort of let us confidently transition. Thirds of our contract acres for this year have gone into the European varieties. We kept a couple of farms planting with New Dale this year, just as a bit of a just to smooth out the transition. Not all of our growers were prepared to try a new variety yet. But in any case, the numbers were very, very close to those sort of projected sort of wants from the sort of all malt craft brewing industry. So we're really looking forward to moving ahead with these. And, even just barley selection rate, with the, considering the amount of grain that we're losing to pre-harvest sprouting, the dormancy in these European varieties is going to give us a tremendous advantage in the number of acres that we actually have to contract to accomplish sort of our volume for the year. Whereas we would typically be contracting nearly 3 times the acres as it should take to yield the tonnage we need. We might be able to cut that down by 30 or 40% with the higher success rates of the European varieties. So win for the growers and for the brewers. So I guess I don't know how. I mean, I've been rambling on about these malt analysis, but I'm not really sure how often you guys are getting access to like a full spec malt analysis like this, with looking at sort of beta glucans, total proteins, S&T ratios. I've seen malt websites or manufacturer websites where they're basically giving you a range of diastatic power, alpha amylase, and like maybe fan, but maybe rather than just me getting into the weeds any further, we could sort of have a bit of a discussion, like if there's specific points you guys want to look at in terms of these malt analysis, if there's some measurements here that you're not familiar with, and you'd like me to go into a bit more detail in terms of how, if you do have access to this kind of analysis, how you can use that to manage your sort of your brewing day, your brewing setup. You know, I think the relationship between diastatic power and alpha amylase, for example, can really influence where you might want to set your mash temperature, how you might want to step it if you're doing step mash. But if you're going to do a single infusion mash, this relationship can sort of affect how you set your water temperatures for targeted beer styles. So you may find that you're buying, you know, a 2-row malt, sort of just a 2-row base, and then a month later you get another lot number and you wanted a sweet finish on your beer. You do everything else the same, but all of a sudden this one's dry. Like oftentimes it can have a lot to do with this specific relationship between the total diastatic power and the alpha amylase. So if you have access to those numbers, you can adjust your mash accordingly to try to target, you know, a similar finish in the same recipe. But and same sort of fan, another, you know, strong indicator for you know, how you want to manage your fermentation in terms of if you're looking for high attenuation or low attenuation, how you might be able to predict flavor stability or storage stability, for example. A lot of influence there. And then some of these, like protein levels, S&T ratio, beta glucans, these are going to be measures that you would use to predict efficiencies. So you might, you know, adjust the way your water to grist ratios to help accommodate. You might adjust your mill settings, for example, or you know, or whatever methods you're using for sparging. So yeah, how do I open that up for?
That's a good question there, Devin. I mean, I know from my perspective, I've never looked that deep into the malt analysis, so it's interesting to see. And when you bring up things like how this can impact things, like, for example, if I'm making the same beer with a different malt and expecting the same result, I'm not going to get it, because it's not because maybe of my process, but it could be just the fact that the malt and the way that those ratios play.
For sure. And I mean, one of the points that I was trying to make through there too is that although looking at those charts, I mean, the differences can look insignificant because we're talking, you know, 1 or 2% for a lot of these measures. But in terms of the implications to brewing efficiency, attenuations, yeast health and stuff, like they're not insignificant differences. And those genetics are really what sort of influence those final numbers. So if we're taking, for example, the Metcalf and the Newdale, year over year in the last 5 years, like we're optimizing our process and we're hitting, you know, we're under 1% sort of deviation year over year on those malt specs. We're managing our process to be able to accomplish that. But those sort of thresholds, those relationships between soluble protein and diastatic power, those are really driven by the barley's genetics. And so we sort of hit that one when we've done our job properly. We produce a malt, a COA that is sort of varietal specific. And then, I mean, if we've got issues with the processing, or if the malt or if the barley quality is lacking, then we start to see sort of more spread. But ultimately, those but we do, I guess the thing is that we do single origin malting. So when we're buying our barley, we keep all the different farm lots separate. We don't blend varieties and we don't blend lots. So when we've got a COA, it's very representative of what's, you know, what of the malt that's being sold because we're updating it for the specific grain lots. Whereas the sort of the bigger malting facilities are more often blends. So they're taking, you know, several different malt analysis, blending them at different ratios to sort of get within a range. They'll often sort of even even in the advertising or in the sort of COAs that are provided with the malts, you'll end up with a range like diastatic power 120 to 150. And it doesn't have enough resolution to really inform sort of changes to your brewing process, in my opinion. Like with those differences, like that kind of offering of a range of numbers is a bit too broad. But yeah, again, I'm not familiar with exactly what sort of level of analysis you guys have access to when you're typically buying grain.
Does anybody have any comments on that, like, or any questions there for Devin?
I don't mind admitting that as a dumb home brewer that just goes to the shop and picks up the bag of grain, you know, best I can do is buy a giant sack of, you know, 25 kilograms bag and brew with that. There's no output on the bag that says this lot has these kind of values within it.
Right.
So the most I can hope for is that you're doing pretty much a consistent process amongst the farms that you purchase from.
Mm-hmm.
And I can make my adjustments based on that assumption, but that's really the amount of detail I go to. I'm wondering, we have a couple of pro brewers on. Do you guys look into this? Does it inform a lot more about your yields?
That's a good point. I mean, like, I guess if you're looking for, I would assume if you're a professional brewer that you're looking to get the biggest bang for your buck, right? So you would want to, I think, delving into these numbers would probably be of a benefit to you. That's just a guess, right?
And a lot of tends to be a relationship with the breweries, and the higher the volume, the more specific a COA they'll get in terms of what's actually being delivered. So whereas you look at, you know, I think even if you look at the Wireman's website, they'll have, you know, typical specs for all their products that you could, you know, go online and look it up, but you wind up with a range, giving themselves a fair bit of leeway in terms of what it could be. Whereas if you're buying it by the rail car, you'll get, you know, breweries will get a COA that's precise to what's in the rail car, I guess. So yeah, it's tricky because there is a lot in those COAs that could inform your process, but, you know, admittedly there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of, you know, getting that information in enough detail to be able to, you know, modify that. And I think that's one of the things that the craft doing, or the craft malting industry, I should say, is, you know, is offering the smaller craft breweries access to that they may not have, you know, they may not typically have. So for us, you know, with our regular commercial customer base, like, we can provide them with, you know, detailed malt analysis, lot to lot, and origin to grain origin, so that we can be making those sort of smaller adjustments, a couple of degrees here or there, to sort of target, you know, slightly lower alpha amylase but level, for example, or a higher diastatic power. And so it's an advantage that we can provide to those sort of craft brewers that are buying by the bag as opposed to buying by a sort of graded lot. I think we're starting to see, as I was discussing, the shift in the industry, the demand for that chemistry is changing. So is the level of interest in that sort of more, sort of that finer detail in terms of the malt analysis. Like, we're getting more and more common that the customers are interested in knowing, like, what's the beta glucan level in this malt, or what's the, you know, whereas, you know, when we first, even 3 years ago, it was something that was almost never sort of considered or asked about.
So do you think that then, Devin, that your customers, like the brewery customers, et cetera, are becoming, I want to say, more educated in what they're looking for?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I like to think that part of that is, with customers that we've been working with, that because we've been able to provide that, it's sort of helped sort of foster that sort of interest in a deeper sort of, demand for that information. But I think there's also, a higher, every year there's more and more brewers coming through formal education programs where they're diving into these numbers, and these brewers are starting to be hired on as sort of head brewers, whereas, the brewery might have started, with an owner operator, and not necessarily have, formal education in the sense of like diving into these details and having access to. So we start to see more and more interest, I think, number of different reasons. Like the more mature a craft brewery becomes, I think the more data they've collected in their own process, then the more more questions they're starting to ask about, why did this or that, create a different beer, what sort of they're getting in their brew house over time, year over year, with a flagship, for example, and they're seeing differences in attenuation or something that they might not be really able to explain. So they're starting to look, deeper into but I think some of that stuff takes time to be able to recognize the patterns and oh yeah, I mean, as the industry matures, I think certainly we get, more interest in real detailed specs on the malt, and malt sort of seems to be getting a bit of a renaissance in terms of appreciation, with trends moving towards sort of lagers and sort of lower hop style beers the last couple of years. Like we see a lot more focus on the malt specifics as trends, whereas when beer IPAs, like double IPAs, are the sort of leading trendsetter, then at that point, your malt analysis might not be as critical because you're mostly just looking for extract at that point. And color. So.
Yeah. We had a question come in from on the chat, and it had to do with what kind of steps can the average home brewer take to become more aware of what malt they're getting and how it'll affect each brew. So like, what can we do, like from our perspective? Like, I know that, for example, you gave us a great deal of information on the malt analysis, but what can we do so if we walked into, for example, like what Max said, I walk into the store, I ask for a bag of grain and I get a bag of grain and I expect it to make beer. Right. But
yeah, well, I think that even though you're probably, and there's going to be a wider range with the data that you can find, like, for example, but I think you can start to dig into the manufacturers' websites. I think that, like, as we're talking about these trends evolving where the brewers are more interested in, in a higher level of detail with respect to the malt chemistry. So the big malt houses are reacting also, like they're starting to cater to the craft brewers more specifically in terms of making some of that data available. So if you look through, Wireman's website, for example, if you start digging through there and looking at their different styles, they will have a certain amount of information. They might not have a full malt analysis just because they're going to be averaging their numbers and they might update that every growing season, for example. So they might have, for what the average protein for 2020 might be 11%, 2021, if it's 12, they'll update their numbers to reflect that. So you can check out their websites and dig into the products that you're picking up. So even if you're buying, for example, a couple of pounds where you don't have the original sort of malt bag, 25 kg bag or whatever, you can still look up that product on the manufacturer's websites. So the only spot where you're probably really going to come up short is with just sort of Canadian two-row. unless you can pinpoint, who malted it, whether it's a RAR product or a Canada Malt product or whatever. But generally, I think those companies are becoming more aware that people are looking for that information. So they're posting, even though it may be a little bit limited, they'll still be posting it on their websites. And then so you can see, I think that'll probably in most cases give you enough resolution to be able to inform your brewing. So if you look at, these differences I've been talking about between European and North American genetics, you're going to see that sort of difference reflected in, a Canada Malt product compared to a Wireman product, for example, or a crisp product. So if you can find, if they'll give you a range of diastatic power, alpha amylase, and FAN, for example, then you can compare that to a North American 2-row spec and adjust accordingly if you're substituting a British pale ale malt for a malt pale ale, like have differences in those malts just based on like the color and flavor profile may be sort of not critical in terms of your recipe, but you might see differences in the chemistry enough from where you can adjust your mash, for example, to accommodate, like if you're shooting for I think you can probably find just through the manufacturer's web, it's enough information to start playing with some of those differences, even though they're not good. You probably wouldn't get the full list of profile like I showed on those charts, but
yeah, interesting. I was going to ask something about terroir and how it affects the flavor that comes out of the malts, right? I mean, I know you mentioned you're getting these different styles of barley and that type of stuff. Are they all coming from Ontario, or are they coming from elsewhere? And how does that impact what you bring out of it?
Right. Well, if you look at malt flavor, there's a sort of a hierarchy in terms of influence, and it would be sort of malt house, variety, and then terroir. So there is enough, like the different varieties of barley will have a greater influence than soil type, or with the exception of some extreme weather conditions, you're not going to see sort of terroir expressed between the same variety grown in Ottawa versus Guelph. Like it's too nuanced. I mean, there have been some people studying just that the degree of differentiation is so subtle that by the time you add yeast, by the time you add hops, those differences are overwhelmed. Like variety is a little bit more influential. They're like different barley varieties tend to have different characteristics that are consistent across the variety more so than sort of growing location. And then the malt houses ultimately have sort of overwhelming influence over both. Like, so with a Pilsner malt, for example, a very low kilned malt, where the grains sort of, where the flavor profile is a little more neutral in terms of the malt house influence, you might be able to differentiate varieties. Like after working with Metcalfe and Newdale for so long, I feel like I can differentiate the two, but at the same time I could, we always sort of use the example that if you took two different barley varieties, two different malt houses, and one brewer, and the two different malt houses made the same malts, but with different varieties, and then had them brewed identically in 4 beers, you'd be more able to differentiate the malt house than you would the variety of the barley. I think is sort of in terms of like the degree of influence. So we try to sort of stay away from talking too much about terroir, just because it, I mean, it can be a bit of a trap. I mean, partly it's ego, because we're like, yeah, we're the ones doing it. Like this, we're crafting this malt, and this flavor is, you know, this is Barn Owl Malt flavor. But also because we don't have enough freedom. The growing conditions in Ontario, finding quality barley throughout we have contracted farms all over the province. We've got farms putting barley in like New Liskeard, North Bay, Guelph, Ottawa, Morrisburg, like all over the province. And it takes the whole province for us every year to be able to find enough barley at quality. So if we start getting too hung up on, oh, this is, you know, this barley or this malt is unique because it was grown in Prince Edward County, and then next year we don't have any Prince Edward County barley that meets grade, we just sort of shot ourselves. So I mean, and I honestly don't think that the level of sort of differentiation from growing regions within the province is enough to sort of, I feel like we would be disingenuous if we sort of tried to play up terroir as I mean, I think there may be sort of an overall Ontario sort of vein to it, but in terms of within the province, like, I mean, the humidity in Ontario, the summer temperatures, the amount of moisture does affect the barley as compared to Western Canada, but you know, it's about as fine and sort of resolution as we would get on it, and
that's neat. That's neat. It's neat to hear, right? I mean, because you know, I just always think about it. I wonder, right? So it is interesting, right? I don't know. I'm sucking up all the air here. So does anybody else have any questions or anything else they want to discuss with Devin? Throw it open there, and then see if there's anything else that's out there.
One thing that I have a question on, and I don't even know if you can answer this, but you obviously prepare the malt so that we can use it, but then sometimes homebrewers want to modify that, say they're short of an ingredient or whatnot. So you know, the thing that I hear is, well, shove it on a baking sheet and shove it in your oven and dry it out a little bit and get it a little bit more roasty. What does that do to the product that you've produced that we then modify?
what does it do with it in terms of, like, I mean, subjectively, I mean, you're modifying the flavor profile and the color profile by sort of roasting sort of a previously finished malt, which is basically what malt houses are doing when they're producing sort of high colored, you know, roasted malts anyways. They'll be taking a finished base malt and then running it through, you know, off a conventional kiln, and then running it through a drum roaster, like a coffee roaster machine, sort of get those higher colors and flavor profiles. In terms of the malt chemistry, it's much harder to predict because there's relationships between temperature and the chemistry, so, which is also affected by moisture. So depending on what the moisture content is and what temperature you subject it to, that will affect the diastatic power. So the enzyme content in malt that you expect, that you want to have capacity conversion. If you're just roasting it for color, then, you know, it's totally subjective. But if you're wanting that malt then be a driver for conversion or fully self-convert, then, you know, you're starting to get into some unknowns in terms of how that's going to be affected. So the diastatic power it's temperature sensitive. You can denature those enzyme content. The higher the moisture and the higher the temperature, the more readily it's denatured. So there's an inverse relationship between temperature and moisture in terms of the stability of the enzymes. So when we're kilning, we use moisture content cues to drive our temperature steps throughout the drying process. So like if we're trying to develop the flavor and color profile on a pale ale malt, for example, like a British style pale ale malt, we'll have a different moisture threshold for when we start increasing temperatures than we would for a Pilsner malt, for example. And that's because those sort of all those hydrolytic sort of reactions and sort of are all sort of relative to moisture and temperature. So, and the enzyme content, the enzymes are denatured more easily or at lower temperatures with higher moisture. So, getting into the weeds again, but oh yeah, it's in terms of malt chemistry, it would be really hard to predict how that would affect it. But in terms of, like I say, in terms of roasting for color and flavor, then it's just subjective. It's like making toast darker or lighter.
Sander, I think you had a question too, so go ahead.
Oh, there we go. This is actually I guess a grain question. Have you ever done red fife before for commercial use or just for brewing use at all here in Ontario?
Yeah, we've not malted like a commercial batch of red fife wheat. We've got a couple of growers in the area, and it's more just the opportunity hasn't really presented itself. It's a pretty niche grain in terms of there's some it's a bit cost prohibitive, I guess, in terms of the market for red fife in the province. Like if we're buying red fife wheat, we're competing with stone milled bagged flour price essentially, because all the growers of red fife wheat in Ontario are generally direct to consumer growers. So they either have their own milling operation and flour brand, or they're selling to sort of a craft miller or sort of a bakery, organic bakeries or whatever. So we've had some demand for it, but usually when we start sort of lining it up, the interest wanes when we start sort of indicating how much the wheat's going to cost.
That's really interesting, actually. And then I was going to ask, do you know what row it is? Like a row grain?
Well, it's a hard red winter wheat.
Okay.
So if that's it.
I don't know, like 2 row, 6 row, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, the wheat is, we don't see sort of 2 row, 6 row in the wheat. So, wheat would be more commonly classified by sort of spring wheats or winter wheats, and then hard and soft. So hard and soft, typically referring to the nature of the proteins and the protein levels. Like hard wheats tend to have, they tend to be steely and higher protein. The soft wheats tend to be mealy and lower protein. And then the winter wheats are planted in the fall. They overwinter in the field and then finish their growing cycle in the spring and early summer. And then spring wheats are planted in the spring. So red fife is a landrace variety, I guess, that is a hard red winter wheat, and that would be sort of how it's sort of classified in the realms of the wheat varieties.
Cool, awesome. Thanks so much.
So when we're malting wheat, we typically malt soft red winter wheat. We found the proteins in the hard reds tend to be a bit too steely, sort of harder to deal with, and then and white wheat, like you'd see white wheat commonly in the brewing supply shops because it's very commonly grown in Western Canada. So those Western malt houses are working with white wheat, and there are very few growers in Ontario that grow white wheat. It's more susceptible to humidity-based diseases and stuff like that. So similar problems to what we have with barley.
Crazy.
So I had a question for you. You're talking earlier about Ontario wheat compared to Western wheat.
Mhm.
What are you sort of looking at? Which is sort of what's the difference and which is sort of better to go with depending on your style?
Well, I mean, I think wheat is a
I mean barley, like general, like not wheat, but I mean general, like barley, like your 2-row and what have you.
right. So if you're looking for, like, if you're going to be doing any kind of adjunct brewing, right away you're going to probably want to lean towards like North American barley varieties. So you'd be looking for a Canada malt product, a raw malting product, something from that's grown in North America, because those varieties are going to have been bred more specifically for adjunct brewing. They're going to have excess enzyme, excess fan. So if you're adding any unmalted products or any sort of raw grains or whatever that you want to be converted, that you want to actually sort of break that down and make fermentables from, you would have better attenuation and better conversion using North American varieties in general. But then if you want lower attenuating, if you're using sort of all grain beers, and particularly if you want to age beers, if you're going to leave them for long fermentation periods, and if you're going to cellar them, the European varieties are going to provide better flavor stability, more moderate sort of long fermentations. If you're going to do a prolonged or mixed fermentations, the lower fan in the European varieties is going to regulate that yeast health so that it's less aggressive, and that you're going to have a bit more control over a longer ferment in terms of, it'll be more reactive to temperature as well. So if you're trying to if you're trying to do a lagering process and you want slow, prolonged fermentation, the lower fan malts are going to perform better in that environment. And then again, if you're going to age a beer, if you're going to bottle it and cellar it, you'd be looking for something with lower fan, lower enzyme package, and that's typically going to come from European varieties or low protein varieties. But
So then you're saying if you're going to do like lagers, stick with like German, European sort of grains. If you do them more like the ales and stuff, stick with the like North American ones, like Canadian ones.
yeah, you'll have more control over your fermentation. I mean, and I think, and part of what we've been responding to from the commercial brewers is that when they're using 2-row base malts, the conversion is just so aggressive and so fast, and the fermentation is so aggressive and so fast that they're trying to do step mash, or they're trying to do variable temperature ferments, but they can't keep it under control. Like, it's, they'll finish a brew, pitch the yeast, and come back in the morning, it's done. And it's and they were like, oh, I was gonna cold crash that and lager it for 3 weeks, but it's an ale now. And it's just because these varieties, these North American varieties, are just so hot. Like, they're so part of the response, like with us moving to these less aggressive varieties in terms of diastatic enzyme packages and stuff, is that the brewers are becoming, we have more demand from brewers to be, looking for step mash. They want to be doing decoction mashing and lagering and mixed ferments and aged barrel aging and stuff. But the North American varieties are just so aggressive. Like, the fan is so high that the yeast is moving so fast that they don't have a chance to manage it. And it's just, I mean, the typical conversion time, I mean, a lot of people are, conventionally mashing for 45 to 60 minutes with North American barley. But from our lab results, like, full conversion is finished within 7 minutes. So it's
Wow.
yeah.
Holy cow, 7 minutes.
I mean, that's lab conditions, so you're not going to see that, but still, I mean, 15 minutes, you're good.
I'm wasting my time.
15 minutes for conversion. Holy crap.
Yeah,
I'm
start warming it up.
Jeez.
At what temperature is that at?
Like, the Congress mash is a step mash, so it would start at like 62 and work its way up to 68 and 70.
Wow.
15
15 minutes. Wow.
but that's, I mean, you can run through those steps based on the Congress mash lab methods, but it doesn't even make it to, you maybe make it to, you started at, if you're starting at 62 degrees, it's done by the time you get to, well, I guess it'll make it, you know, at a degree per minute step, like they'll run it through, but it's pretty well finished after, you know, 7 or 8 minutes. And then
Wow.
often they'll say, you know, even in a brew house conditions, optimum grist ratio is like 4 to 1. You'd be looking at, you know, 15, 20 minutes. You could expect near complete conversion. So
Damn. So I can cut down my
Yeah, you
my
can cut
mash
down your
time
brew day.
to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Damn,
yeah,
that's-
have you guys typically using sort of iodine through and watching for
No.
like
I've used it. I've used it in the past, right? I haven't done so in some
No.
time, right? Because I just figured, but to use iodine would be obviously is beneficial for this sort of stuff for checking conversion. I mean, so is part of the reason that, like, I mean, I know one of the recent talks about Barn Owl's grain was the short grown Pilsner. And I know you mentioned if you're doing like mixed fermentations or barrel aging, etc. And I know that the short grown Pilsner that you guys do is really meant or really useful in sours and such. Is this something that you're finding is as well is desirable for, or is this something that you're seeing people ask for?
Yeah, so we launched that product purely in response to demand, like for malt that was, I mean, it's basically a strategy that we use to manage those high enzyme, high sort of conversion rates, high attenuation rates in the North American barley varieties. So we developed the short grown as basically, it's like if you've got too much fan, you've got too much enzyme content or excess, and I shouldn't say too much, but you have surplus. We were throwing it some protein to chew on, basically. So you take the short grown and add it in at a sort of at whatever ratio. I mean, we've got guys that'll brew with it at 70, 80%, even 100% sometimes. But generally it was designed to be used at like, 30, 40, 50% maybe. And really it's to help manage those conversion rates, to help manage those fermentations, to sort of extend the fermentations, to sort of rein it in a little bit by providing some more complex sugars, more complex carbohydrates, stuff that's a little bit harder for the enzyme activity to actually break down. Like when we fully modify a North American malt, like it's so, the solubility is so high and the enzyme is so high that it's hard to control those conversion and ferments. But when we add in some unfermented or partially fermented malts, you provide some longer chain, more complex molecules that stress the enzyme a little bit. And then in terms of a longer term, like a longer mixed ferment, you create a more diversity of foodstuffs. So you have a collect, whereas a fully modified malt that's very quickly converted, you're going to have a lot of homogeneity in terms of the fermentables. And so if you have mixed cultures that have different preferences in terms of the molecular size and makeup, you may not even have a foodstuff that's suitable for one of the mixed cultures. Whereas if you have a diverse sort of complement of fermentables through mixed modification, then you provide sort of foodstuffs to try to hopefully hit sort of a sweet spot for each of the different sort of cultures that you've got involved in a mixed ferment. So, and then we've got brewers that use it just for head retention and body. Like, so Another common complaint with the North American barleys, and not just our maltings of the North American barleys, but the North American barleys in general, is just that getting a body or getting beers with good head retention and mouthfeel can be challenging, and so oftentimes they're having to use wheat products or malted wheat, for example, but then you have issues with clarity. So an under-modified barley can sort of help to provide those same benefits in terms of head retention and mouthfeel, without some of the without having to get into some of the wheats or hazy or sort of ways of accomplishing that. So you can get a nice, clear, low color sort of lager that's still got some head retention and mouthfeel is sort of the idea. Because the partially modified malts tend to be really low color as well. There's a correlation between the degree of modification and the baseline color. So if we do a Pilsner malt fully modified, we might have a color of 2.2. If we do the same malt but with a partially modified or a short grown, we're usually like 1.7, 1.8. So it's a nice way to get some of that body and sort of structure in a beer that's meant to be sort of crystal clear and low color.
Nice. I didn't know that. Nice. Does anybody else have any other questions for Devin? We got a lot of people online, so everybody's been listening. So if not, that's all right.
Fell asleep.
No, I found it really interesting. I mean, I don't know about anybody else. I'm sure everybody else. I know.
We're listening.
Okay, there you go. So Marcelo's there. I found it really interesting. It's something that I think as a home brewer sometimes we take for granted, because we look at malts and we a lot of times we focus on things like hops or the yeast and that type of stuff. And yeah, we do use malts because, or different styles, because like, okay, you know what, I want to use, this Belgian style of malt in this particular Belgian beer, or, we talk about Wehrmann, like I use floor malted Bohemian Pils because I like it. And because I know it can go different ways for different styles within the lagers that I like to brew. But it is really, really interesting to hear a perspective that we often, I guess, neglect sometimes, right? Because we focus so much on other things that we put into the beer, right?
Yeah, and I mean, malt was, it's sort of lagged in terms of the trendiness, in terms of the craft scene. I mean, the craft scene was sort of launched on the back of hops and sort of differentiation and sort of appreciation of hops and it's cycling through, and malt is starting to get a little bit more recognition. I think the sort of emergence of the craft malting industry was sort of a big part of that, just in that it gives opportunity to talk about differentiation, to talk about sort of, you've got more brands out there, you've got more malt houses using different techniques, so you're starting to create opportunity to explore new sort of products and flavor profiles and varieties. The smaller malt houses, we can respond so quickly too. I mean, we could change varieties very quickly and adapt to different demands. I mean, we've malted sunflower seeds, and we just have the ability to be a little bit more reactive, or more quickly anyways. So it's creating more interest in the grain side of things.
Cool. There was a couple questions. I know that somebody had asked about which homebrew suppliers carry Barn Owl, and I know it's Toronto Brewing. I don't know if there's any others.
Yeah, Toronto Brewing's the sort of most consistent carrier. We've we've had some sort of starts and stops elsewhere. We've never really found any other homebrew sort of consistent sort of homebrew retail partners outside of Toronto. Like Ottawa's been another market we've had a lot of demand from, but have had a hard time doing the retail thing there. But yeah, and the Toronto brewing just seems to have such a wide reach that it's sort of has satisfied most of the demand. We've got a small brewing community in Kingston that's close enough that we just sort of handle that in house. But yeah,
it's tough I mean, I think what we have to remember as well is when you started the talk tonight, you did mention it's you and your wife. So and you've got, like, you said you hired somebody else. So
Yeah.
It's not exactly, a huge operation that you're running, but it's something that obviously people are interested in and want to support.
Yeah.
And as I want to say, like, as our local maltster, right? I mean, because you're about as close as it's going to get for us in the GTA, right? You're only in Belleville, which isn't that far, right?
Yeah.
It'll be good to get, once we see them again at Toronto Brewing. I've been keeping an eye open. Like I said, I know Colin Green had brewed his Vienna lager using your Vienna, and he loves it. I had it yesterday. It's unlike any other Vienna that I've had, and I would just go out and just get, okay, well, just like you said, it's a Vienna, but it really had this sort of unique, almost like a bready type of taste that I really enjoyed. But I look forward to getting some more of it
we're due to restock Toronto Brewing. I'm not sure whether Les had been talking to them or not, but we were just sort of, I mean, we sort of expected things to be, we didn't really know what to expect, I guess, this time last year when, but the demand for us has just been bonkers. Like, and we got, we started having a hard time getting supply into Toronto Brewing, but we've got a bit of a window here before, the summer madness. So we'll try to get a skid off into there so that people have got some access to it.
Yeah, great.
I had a question coming back to your conversion. Now,
Sure.
Your 15-minute conversion, I guess half an hour is sort of safe.
Yeah.
Now, is that on any scale, like a five heck down to homebrew size, or does it really matter the size you're converting? You're doing mashing.
Yeah, I think the bigger drivers in terms of like conversion time and is not so much going to be the scale of the brew house, but it's more going to be a function of your grist profile in terms of like how fine or coarse you've milled it, in combination with your water to grist ratio. So you're not going to get a 15 or 20 minute conversion in a 2-to-1 ratio for a double IPA.
Right.
But if you're working with like a 4-to-1 water ratio, like you're going to have more, because it's, to get that quick conversion, you also need to have rapid hydrolyzation of the malt. So that's going to be when you start working with coarser grain or sort of a suboptimum crush and a high grain ratio to water, like that's when you're going to be waiting. You spend as much time waiting for the grain to hydrolyze as you are waiting for the conversion process.
Right.
And that's the step that is not measured in the lab analysis. Like when they're saying like 15-minute conversion, that's because they're turning it into a flour and it's hydrolyzed almost instantly. So there'll be that lag, and that will really be it. How well it's stirred, what kind of sort of, if you're stirring it at all and stuff. So all those elements will affect your total sort of mash and conversion time. But like theoretically, if all things are moving along. Like,
yeah, very good. Okay. Yeah, because I'm like, wow, 15 minutes, like that's pretty quick. Cut the brew day down in half by then.
Yeah.
So
Okay, awesome. Well, I just want to say on behalf of
Hey, I got one quick question actually.
Oh, there you go, Bart. There you are.
And hey, Devin and Bart here. I apologize if it's been asked. I was in and out of the meeting, but what can you tell us about grain storage? I know a lot of us, we brew on and off. Like for instance, I don't brew over the winter, so
Right.
oxygen obviously probably makes the malt go stale. But what are
Yep.
your sort of expectations for using your grains? And then for us that don't brew so often, how long can we push it before we start to compromise on the flavors and the quality?
Right. So, yeah. So in terms of storage, like just right off, some of your like malt is very dry, and when we malt it, we are so barley naturally has sort of a bit of a sort of waxy sort of water barrier on it on the husk, and that when we're malting it, when we're hydrating it, that basically gets broken down and washed off. So finished malt has a very, very high capacity to absorb moisture, and moisture just in the air. So relative humidity is a killer for malt. Like it'll go what we call it slack. And so basically it'll just absorb moisture from the air, and then the malt will get sort of soft. The husk will get soft, so that you might still chew the kernel or crush the grain, and the inside, like the endosperm, will still be floury and friable, but the husk will be sort of a bit mushy. That's what we call slack, and that will really negatively impact your sort of ability to crush it. Doesn't necessarily spoil the malt, but the higher the moisture content, the lower the higher the risk for spoilage, just in general. Oxidative, staling, it will stale over time. And then so basically for storage, you want to keep it, you don't want to have it exposed to air. You want it in dry, sealed space, and then moderate, just keep it away from temperature swings. You don't necessarily need to freeze it or whatever. Just you don't want it in somewhere where the temperature is moving up and down, because then you get risk for condensation or sweating, or when temperatures change dramatically, it's never positive for grain in storage. In terms of like freshness and flavor stability and stuff, like for a lot of our commercial customers, like we're like 48 hours from kilning to brewing often. Like we're like, and again, but part why we have had such a hard time of keeping inventory at Toronto Brewing is because mixed orders have tended to get tricky for us, just because of the turnover. Like we don't have standing inventory. It's not really by design that we're packaging and shipping within 24 hours of kilning. It's just a sort of consequence of the demand. But there are volatiles that probably have a shelf life of about a month, where there's going to be some volatiles and some aromatics that are distinctly fresh. Not to say that after that point the malt is degraded, but in terms of our competitive advantage and ability to offer sort of a unique product to the brewers, it's that 1 month window where they're just not going to get malt that fresh anywhere else. So in terms of like from a practical standpoint, in terms of home brewing, and you don't need to be looking for package date. You could, like, if it's been well stored, or even if it's been sort of just on a skid in a stitched bag, 6 months is going to be safe. Once the bag's open, you're going to want to get it into something tighter than that. Like if you're buying it by the bag, you might want to transfer that bag into a second container or something, just to keep the air out of it. And but yeah, humidity is the biggest thing. Humid air, having access to the grain. Oftentimes those grain bags, once you pull this, and even the stitching is often not tight, so they'll have the plastic liner or whatever, or laminated poly bags, but the stitching itself will over time let moisture get into the malt. I mean, theoretically, it can last for a couple of years, you know, perfectly shelf stable as long as you keep the moisture out of it. But yeah, for us, we're just we're targeting this sort of niche window of, you know, usually young malt, I guess, in terms of that freshness. But it's not to say that, you know, older malt is not.
Well, the fresher the better, right? You know?
Yeah, I mean, we're finding that. I mean, there was a, you know, the malting. There's an old thing in malting that you're supposed to age your malt for, you know, 4 or 6 weeks. It's a bit of a antiquated sort of theory because it was based on, you know, drying systems, older drying systems that didn't dry the barley very evenly. You'd have wet spots through the malt, and so you would set it in a bin or into storage for several weeks to let the moisture migrate throughout the malt, so that you even it out throughout the product, so that you can crush it properly, and so that it brews properly. But with a modern fan kiln system, like, we dry it down to 3%, 3.5%, and at that point, there's very little water migration going on, and it's evenly distributed, and so we get it out the door quick, and it seems to be a positive attribute for the brewers to have that freshness. It's hard to quantify it, though. There's not a lot of good literature behind it in terms of, like, these are volatiles that are lost at this rate, or these are oxidative reactions that are sort of degrading your color profile at this rate. Like, it's malt's kind of funny for being such an old, you know, one of the oldest industrial processes. It's there's still a lot of unknowns.
Is there any more forgiveness for crystal malts and roasted malts?
Yeah, I mean, the crystal malts will probably not take up water quite as readily, just because that crystallized endosperm is going to be, you know, sealed, I guess, in a sense. The husk might be a little bit slack, and at that point, a lot of those crystal malts, the husks are getting pretty flaky and falling off anyways, just from the heat. They're in, like, the higher colored crystals, like, they're starting to get pretty, they're either ruptured or being sort of charred, I guess, during the roasting process. So you might not be too worried about it. So they might not be quite as susceptible to sort of humidity damage or, like, degradation from just humidity in the air. But I think some of the roasted malts are probably going to have they're going to have potentially some volatiles that are less stable. Like, you probably will tend towards the older, like, if you're looking at dark colored roasted malts, roasted barleys, you're probably going to start to lose the nuance of the sort of gentler flavors, and basically just wind up with sort of more bitter forward sort of charcoal flavors, I guess, at the, you know, the longer, like, I think that those specialty malts, you might have some concern over volatility. And I know that smoked malts, you know, they'll degrade fairly quickly. Like, there's a lot of volatile compounds that will affect smoked malts. So, you know, even if it's well sealed, you're still going to have that flavor profile change. Like, so it's not going to just go away completely, but it might shift to being more sort of astringent, and you might lose some of that fruitiness, for example, for a cherry or an apple smoked malt, and you wind up with something that just kind of tastes like varnish, like or paint thinner. But so yeah, I would probably be inclined to sort of keep volumes on hand, like, fairly low for some of those, you know, higher colored and, you know, especially products like smoked stuff, just because there's volatiles there that you're gonna lose. Again, it's going to be hard to quantify it. It's hard to say, you know, you're going to lose this sort of ppm over, you know, X many weeks, but just in general.
Is that the same for, like, peat smoked malt as well? Same
Yeah,
thing
so
goes with it?
peat smoked malt, like it's going to have, you know, a shelf life in that same respect, in terms of like, and it may, you know, it may not, again, it's going to be hard to quantify, but there's different molecular weight compounds that are creating that peat aroma, and some of them are going to be more or less volatile than others. So the longer it sits from the time that it was smoked, the flavor profile is going to shift.
Okay.
May or may not be in a way that, like, it's not to say that it's definitely getting worse. It's just, it's going to, so if you bought a bag of peated malt and you're using a pound at a time over 2 years, like the beer you made at the first year is going to be different,
Okay,
but not necessarily worse, just different.
right. So you,
Yeah.
you take your chances. It might be worse, but be better, I guess, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're
Flavor
intending,
science is
It also loses smokiness too, wouldn't it?
right. Well, that's what I mean. Like, it's going to lose.
Yeah.
Over time, it's going to change because the different elements will be more or less volatile. So some stuff you're going to lose really quickly, and other stuff's going to hang around a little longer. Tends to be that the less desirable flavor profiles are the ones that really cling.
Okay.
like you want some of that like fruity,
Okay.
you know, sweeter aromatics, and that stuff's going to flash off a little
Right.
fast.
So you can't do like you know,
But if you like
to Robbie beer, you know, with the same bag in 4 years in a row, because it'll end up changing along the way.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
if you're looking for consistency, don't use the same bag over 4 years, right?
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got it.
is there, I don't know if there's anything else for you, Devin.
I have one like.
Oh, there you go,
little-
Aidan. Yeah.
So like kind of related to the crystal malts and roasted malts. Is there sort of any plan for Barn Owl to do roasted malts or crystal malts?
Yeah, so we've been, I mean, we're sort of idly, it's sort of going to be a by chance, or like we're not actively pursuing roasting equipment in terms of like our next, you know, part of our growth strategy. We're sort of watching the classifieds. If somebody's got a 20 kilogram coffee roaster or something that we could get into for a reasonable price, then we could, we would start doing it. It's a really tricky segment for us to get into roasted malts in particular, because they're very low volume and time consuming, like for the scale. So you get like a 10 kilogram roaster, and it takes you, you end up having to have somebody run that all day just to get a couple of bags through. And then a lot of the equipment that's made for roasting grains is coffee equipment, and it's basically priced at a point where you're expecting a $20-$25 valuation per pound on what you're roasting, whereas with malt it's $1 a pound. So economically we haven't been able to make any sense of it, but I'd like to get some small roasting capacity, mostly just for sort of rounding out some recipes for some of our regular customers. Like we've got a bunch of sort of flagship beers and sort of LCBO labeled beers where we're doing like 95% of the grain bill, and we just need a bit of roasted barley to get there. And it's like,
yeah. That's actually why I asked, because there for the last brew slam that we had, the beer I had at the awards ceremony on tap was almost entirely your malt,
right,
with the exception of the roasted malt.
Yeah.
So like that was it. It was like Barn Owl wheat and Barn Owl Munich, and then I had to go to like Environment for the roasted malt because.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I don't know that we would probably do much in the way of crystals, but we are sort of, like I say, idly shopping for a coffee roaster just so that we can get those recipes to round them out. But we've run a strong campaign of trying to convince our customers to take a second look at their crystal malt usage, and we've been pretty successful at getting them to sort of reconsider. I don't know whether we've driven a sort of drop in the crystal sales for the commercial guys, but yeah, because crystal, I don't know, it's another tricky process. It's tough to scale it, and but you know, we can do roasting a little more practically, and you can do such a range of new product once you've got that capacity. We don't have a date for it. It's just, you know, maybe we'll stumble on it tomorrow. Maybe it'll be another year. I don't know. But yeah, we really had to prioritize production capacity. So we invested in doubling our sort of base malt production capacity here, and so that'll roasting at least back another year.
So hey, there's a half a bag coffee roaster on Kijiji right now in Ottawa for 25 grand.
Yeah, I had a look at it. They've got a video on YouTube, I think. Yeah, I'm always watching for it. Yeah, I think we need even a half a bag would be tricky. Like, we need something that could do maybe a half a coffee bag would be a full malt bag. Like, I don't know what, like, those are 100-pound bags often, I think. So yeah, there was another one in Kitchener that was up for sale here not too long ago, but we'll see. Maybe the lockdown will provide some opportunity. I don't know.
So I know you guys are kind of, you're saying you're small scale right now. You're sort of getting bigger.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of the brewers in the county are using a lot of your grains. Are you been able to keep up with their demands and stuff?
Yes and no. I mean, we provide, like, we have to manage what we can make available for them a little bit. So, like, most of our customers would, if we doubled our capacity, would double their orders tomorrow, sort of thing. It's just like, we just like, this is how much we can do. Like, so we'll have to work within these limitations mostly. Like, so, like, with us doubling our capacity this summer, like, basically that whole volume will be, we don't anticipate any ramp up. It's just going to be, today we're selling, 100 tons a year, and tomorrow we're selling, 2 and then 4. Like, so most of those customers in the county are just basically, they would be using 100% our grain if we could make it available. But
right. So I guess they're using yours and somebody else's, I guess, grains, because
so we've really, with those kind of situations, we really just target sort of, the big ticket items where we can sort of, so like the Munich malt, for example, gets, Matron would use a fair bit of that in several of their brews, just because you can sort of drive that sort of Barn Owl Malt character sort of into the forefront, but not necessarily need to use 100% of the grain bill. And then we got McKim Brothers, for example, like, we debated with them back and forth for a long time about how to manage, because they've got their own barley growing program, and then we custom malt for them. Early on, it was like, well, we'll do a percentage of the brewery, and then versus sort of one of the labels and stuff. So we negotiate sort of what we can up with, basically, for those different brewers, and then as we add capacity, we'll just be able to offer them a bit more.
And do you guys also do a line of organic as well?
We don't do organic, no.
Okay.
We've never really had much luck with organic barley. Like, growing conditions in Ontario are really tough for barley in the best of times with conventional growing. So it's just, for organics, I mean, I think we have done some organic grains, just not necessarily, like, we're just not certifying through the process. So we've malted organic wheat, and we've malted organic hulless oats and stuff. We tend to have to use grains that don't have a husk, so that there's a lot of fungal load that comes along with organic grains. And but with hulless oats or wheat, we can like mechanically remove that before malting, essentially. So with barley, with the husk intact, it's whatever's on there in the fields in the malt house, and that's a real problem with Ontario growing conditions.
So then for organics, you need like, I guess, European maltster for that?
There's some really successful organic barley growers in like Saskatchewan, Alberta.
Okay.
So I think there's some lines of organic malts coming out of the West, just because
Right.
they've got that dry enough growing conditions that they can
Okay.
manage it.
So then
And
you're
I mean,
saying,
there's also a price point, like we're basically right at the ceiling for most of the brewers already. And then if they're not certified organic, the premium for a craft sort of small product, like floor malted product, like what we're doing, if you put a organic premium on top of that, we'd basically be past the point of of it being, if there were more breweries that were certified organic, they might have a higher threshold for like a price threshold for that sort of product. But because so few breweries actually have certification to be able to carry that through to package, the incentive's just not there to buy organic, because you can't market it as being organic.
but I thought you don't have to be certified organic to make organic beer.
Yeah, I think the production facility needs to be like, so you don't necessarily have to have a whole separate facility, but
Right.
you'd have to have separate storage for all your grains. And then because there'd be different allowable sanitizing materials, like you'd probably have to, if you were going to brew an organic labeled beer in a conventional brewery, you'd probably have a pretty elaborate sanitizing procedure between the two different lines.
Right. Okay.
And so for us, we don't use nearly the kind of chemicals. Like we could sort of certify the malt house for organic production if there was demand for it. We just haven't seen it.
Good stuff. Any other questions? I've asked this twice already. Any other questions for Devin? Like I've been really interested in what he's had to say. So if not, I want to say on behalf of everybody, on behalf of GTA Brews, Devin, thank you very, very much for taking the time, especially because it's just you and your wife and the other guy, right? It's something special for you to take the time out to talk to us about this, and a lot of it. A lot of us are looking forward to snagging some more of your grain once it gets to Toronto Brewing, right? So
yeah, we'll do the best we can. We've been, but yeah, we'll try to get something out there. I'll get in touch with those guys this week, and even if they don't order it, we'll just send them a skid.
It's not a bad position to be in this much of a demand.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, we didn't really know which way it was going to go this time last year, but sort of we added 30% to our production just in the last year, just to try to come close to keeping up. But we need to double that again. So
good stuff. Well, hopefully soon. We know not this year, but hopefully soon. At one point. You can be in the grain buy, so we can order direct from Barn Owl in the grain buy. So
yeah. Once we get our extra, like we're gonna have more flexibility once we get our addition online here. Like we ran into some trouble with trying to line up a bulk buy out of Ottawa in the spring, where we just got overwhelmed, and we had this really elaborate mixed order, and it's just I hadn't made Vienna malt in like 4 months, and there was 4 bags on the order, and it was holding the whole bloody thing up. Anyways, it was just, we didn't provide them with very good service, I guess. So I'm shy at the current state of our supply and demand to try to commit to bulk buys, but we'll do our best to get some volume into Toronto Brewing, so that
Understood. Thank you very,
Especially
very
now
much.
that we got the new European varieties. We've got this Kelly coming off the line. I'd really like to get some of that Kelly Pilsner into Toronto. Yeah.
I'd be all up for that. Thanks again, Devin. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
So guys, we'll open it up if anybody's got anything to talk about. We only have about 10 minutes left, so.
I like that comment, David. You, your wife, and the other guy. Jeez.
Yeah. Well,
What
I
was
mean,
that?
Well, that's what it was. I feel bad. I feel terrible. It's just like, here we are thinking, oh, you know what? This guy should, they should be able to get grains into Toronto Brewing. They should be able to produce us this. And then it's like, wow, no, there's a lot of pressure there. I mean, good, like I said, good on Devin and Barn Owl, because it's good to be wanted. It's good to be in demand, right? But there's also a lot of stress that comes to that.
Well, yes.
Yeah, we really had to
him
balance
into
that
my
too. Like, I
brewery.
mean, it's hard to keep, sometimes it can seem like sort of a slight or something personal, but we really work hard not to try to sort of keep it so people understand that it's nothing personal. We're just overwhelmed, with that supply, because even our brewing customers can get a little sort of, what do you mean you can't? What do you mean you don't have any malt? Like, I'm brewing tomorrow.
I was thinking of getting him into Falcon too, but I'm sort of going through paperwork right now, so I don't know. So we'll see. Eventually, we'll get you in there.
Yeah.